Today we are going to be covering Chapter 1, which is the importance of ethics in criminal justice. We are going to look at the meaning of ethics. Ethics, also known as moral philosophy, is a branch of philosophy concerned with the study of questions of right and wrong and how we ought to live. Within the study of ethics, there are three branches that we are going to look at: metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. Metaethics are concerned with methods, language, logical structure, and the reason used in the interpretation of ethical terms. For normative ethics, we are concerned with the ways of behaving and the standards of conduct. For applied ethics, we are concerned with solving practical moral problems as they arise, particularly in the professions such as medicine and law. Ethics provides us with a way to make moral choices when we are uncertain about what to do in a situation involving moral issues. We then look at the value of ethics. So these are the reasons that are commonly given for why we study ethics and why you are required to take this class. Ethical considerations are centered to decisions that involve discretion, force, and due process that require people to make enlightened moral judgment. These are things that you're going to be doing in your daily life as you go into law enforcement or the criminal justice fields. So knowledge of ethics enables a person to question and analyze assumptions that are typically not questioned in areas of activity like business and politics. Questioning the criminal justice system should also be encouraged, including raising issues regarding topics such as the relationship between crime and justice, the role of law enforcement, the place of punishment, the limits of punishment, the authority of the state, the proper functions of prison, fairness in the workplace through creating a safe working environment, and equal opportunity. The study of ethics increases sensitivity to issues of right and wrong and the right way to conduct oneself and aids in identifying acts that have a moral content. Only through studying ethics is it possible to define unethical behavior. Unethical behavior is a full understanding of ethical behavior that demonstrates what is included to be not only bad or evil, but also what is also considered an action that is going to allow that bad or evil to occur or to continue to occur. It is important to have the capacity to point out moral reasoning in justifying behavior, and the study of ethics develops that capacity. It is critical that ethical decisions are made, and the study of ethics enables the development of tools that enhance ethical decision making. Training in critical ethics helps us to develop analytical skills and reasoning abilities that are needed to understand the practical as well as the theoretical aspect of the criminal justice system. By understanding ethics, we are enabling an appreciation for the complexity of acts that involve ethical issues and dilemmas. Without knowledge of ethics, criminal justice professionals may be unaware about moral issues that occur within the criminal justice system. The study of ethics helps criminal justice professionals quickly recognize the ethical consequences of various actions and of the moral principles that are involved. Within the criminal justice systems, ethics are the most management and policy-related decisions that will lead to punishment, and it is also the rationale that is used in making these decisions, such as whether to rehabilitate, deter, or impose just deserts. The criminal justice system comprises professionals who exercise power and authority over others and who in some cases are authorized to use force or physical coercion against them. The law, or an accepted standard of behavior, imposes ethical rules and responsibility on these professionals. Ethics is a crucial decision-making that we are going to be using in discretion, force, and due process because criminal justice professionals can be tempted to abuse this power. With normative ethics, we are looking at a fundamental to ethical decision making within the criminal justice system. So through this, we are looking at ethics and determining how we are going to approach every situation. So under the first context, we are looking at it that based on our society, every society is going to have a different set of conduct or a different set of ethical standards, and that through that we must make decisions based off of every individual situation. The other side argues that there is one set of ethical standards that is applied across all societies, and that people have an obligation to do what is known to be right. This is a difficult concept because we cannot assume that everybody knows what is right or wrong, and then how do we adjust and deal with that situation when someone doesn't know what is right, or if their different of right is different than ours. With ethical relativism, people will argue what is morally right or wrong may vary in a fundamental way from person to person or from culture to culture. We cannot simply say that a moral judgment is true for all purposes, for all people, and for all cultures. We can assert only that it is true for a particular person or a social group. This means that when we say that a person in another culture did wrong or acted immorally, we must judge that person by the standard of that culture and not by our own. There are objective moral standards as long as judgments about right and wrong are made relatively. So with this, there are three forms. So these individuals agree that there is a moral right and wrong, but contend that what is right for one person in one culture may be wrong for another. We also look at it from a cultural aspect, so this claims that moral beliefs and practices vary from culture to culture. They may not argue that certain acts or practices are right or wrong in a particular culture. They simply will just note that there are differences between them. We also will have people who will take a position that moral beliefs and practices are going to vary from person to person. Critics draw attention to factors such as moral diversity among different cultures, the varying state of morals in a particular society at different historical periods, and the fact that at any given time there is a high degree of moral disagreement within a particular culture. The proponents of cultural relativism argue that society has a different moral code that explain what acts are permitted and what is not permitted. They also argue that we cannot judge one moral code as being superior to another because there is no objective standard to apply to make such an argument or to make such a judgment. Objections to cultural relativism that show it cannot be viewed as a viable approach to ethical issues. There is a problem with identifying what constitutes a culture or society. So through this can become transformed into a matter of individual ethics, where each person can claim that their moral standards are those that should apply to society or others. With this, we are also not able to explain what ethical standards should apply when cultures overlap. In all societies, standards of conduct change over time, and through this, the culture is faced with a problem of acknowledging these changes while arguing that morality is relative to a culture. A major problem with this is that it operates as a moral isolationism. So this means that arguing that everything is relative tends to suggest that there must be an end to the issue and the debate must stop. We may say that all things are relative, however, we are really saying that we don't care about them. So through this fails to provide us with the answers to the issues and the facts that tend to close off the debate altogether. This can also be closely associated with anthropology, and some even refer to it as an anthropological theory. Some philosophers argue that this is a fact of methodology that requires that we adopt a non-judgmental framework towards the culture that they study, and therefore, as the methodological practice only, this does not involve moral relativism. Other philosophers contend that this contains elements of both methodology and also a value system. We then look at ethical absolutionism. This view argues that there exists an external and unchanging moral law, the same for all people at all times and all places. This is considered valid regardless of thoughts and feelings. This position is the opposite of the previous side, as there can be no consideration for other perspectives because it is argued that there is only one true perspective. So an example of this position arises in arguments regarding capital punishment. So two views prevail on this question. One is empathetic, that the murderer must be given the punishment that they quote unquote deserve, which is death, and the other can see no justification for quote unquote judicial murder under any circumstances. Someone of this philosophy would not change their view with respect to capital punishment no matter what arguments were put forward by either side. If there is a disagreement about moral issues between societies, then how should we act? Going with the previous slide, that individual would say that we should not judge and that there is no single truth that applies across all societies and cultures. Under this current slide, we would argue that one single truth must be applied across all societies and cultures regardless of someone's beliefs or their values. We then move into ethical pluralism. So this argues that in most situations there are many truths rather than just one single truth. This allows us to adopt 4 principles that resolve conflicts between differing ethical standards. We first are going to look at the principles of understanding. This requires that we fully understand and appreciate the meaning of ethical standards found in another culture from the perspective of that culture. For example, before making any judgments about an issue such as a female circumcision, we should possess a full understanding of the history and cultural extent of this practice as it applies in many societies in which it is performed. We should recognize that a Western response to an issue of this nature is shaped and constructed by their own cultural views. We then look at the principle of tolerance. This means accepting the existence of differences as opposed to denying all diversity in ethical standards. This principle rules out an approach based on ethical absolutionism. We then look at the principles of standing up against evil. So we must understand intolerance that ought not to lead us to a position in which, quote unquote, anything goes, as the ethical revelationist argues, but rather we should be prepared to stand up against the moral wrongdoing, especially when such conduct affects the powerless or the marginalized of the world. An example of this kind of moral wrongdoing would be the crime of a genocide, which is internationally recognized as a crime against humanity. The principle of fallibility argues in favor of our own fallibility. We should always be prepared to learn from other cultures and to have our own moral shortcomings exposed. Most countries have prohibited capital punishment for children. However, until 2005 in the United States, the Supreme Court declared that states have the right to execute those as young as 16 years of age. This principle would argue that the United States and its court at the time did not choose the correct ethical position on the issue of capital punishment for juveniles, and that it should be prepared to listen to the reasonings and the experience of the rest of the world, which has outlawed capital punishment for the juveniles. Other philosophers seem to argue that an approach that emphasizes ethical pluralism, which Robert Kane called openness. He stresses that a pluralistic approach or point of view only suggests the possibilities that other views are correct, and it does not demonstrate that they are in fact correct. Pluralism changes absolute values, but it does not rule out their possibilities. Openness does not imply indifference. It is only an indication that someone recognizes that they do not possess the truths and are willing to learn from others and to search for truths beyond their own limited point of view. John Cook suggests an approach that set aside an argument based on tolerance and instead advocates that cases are one by one and must be examined in the light of the detail of each particular case. He suggests that a question of whether we ought to interfere with the practice of another culture is not a physiological question, but it is a practical, moral one. When it comes to religion and ethical standards, many people believe that ethical standards and religion are connected and that ethical standards are derived from a religious principle and tenets. The divine command theory argues that what is morally right is what God directs, and conversely, what is morally wrong is what God prohibits. In a famous discussion, the Greek philosopher Socrates took up the question of whether divine command theory was concerned with the power of the gods to command or the quote-unquote rightness of the gods' command. He asked the question, is conduct right before the gods command it, or do the gods command it before it is right? So according to this perspective, the only issue is the simple matter of God requiring a particular kind of conduct. So if God commands it, then it is sufficient, and if the conduct is right, regardless of what reason tells us. This raises the question of how we discover what constitutes God's will. If we argue that it is contained in religious texts, how do we discover God's will from a multitude of religious texts that exist in many religions on this earth? It is also difficult to determine the exact nature of God's will. If we argue that conduct is right because God commanded it, then we are giving God the power to issue whatever command he wishes, which means that God can give a different command for the one he has already given, so his commands could be considered arbitrary. So under this thought, this means that God's commands are not arbitrary, but emanating from the application of his wisdom in knowing what is best for us. In accepting the rightness of God's commands, we must also accept that there is some standard of right and wrong outside of God's will that must exist prior to the independence of God's command. We must either accept that God's commandments are arbitrary or recognize that his commands have reference to a standard of rightness and wrongness dependent on his will. We then move into ethics and natural law. So the idea of natural law is that underneath the diversity of human cultures and beliefs about what is right and wrong, we can identify some factors that are common to our human nature. Natural laws are said to be laws that govern human behavior and define the right way to live. They are said to be natural because they are thought to be incorporating human nature and the goals of humans seek naturally. Natural law represents a search for moral absolutes that define what is normal and what is considered natural. Boyd-Stephan is an argument grounded in the element of natural law because it proposes to bridge the gap between ethical theory and lived experiences. Arguing that it has often seemed that ethical theories are far removed from people's actual experiences, Stephan suggests an ethical framework that will assist those faced with ethical issues and dilemmas to resolve them by applying what philosophers term as quote-unquote practical reasons. This is a form of reasoning that we apply when we are faced with decisions about how to act and how to live. Stephan's hybrid approach to ethical decision-making is based in natural law, which effectively claims that human beings are rational persons, are naturally endowed with the capacity of reasoning, and are therefore capable of defining the term goodness. According to Stephan, a hybrid ethic is expressed most cognitively in structures and framework associated with the just war thinking. A just war tradition argues that war, in circumstances, can promote a common good and serve for the interests of justice. Through his perspective, he also finds doing ethics that resonates because it blends theory and practice, and this provides a clearly expressed and practical method of resolving ethical issues. We then move into ethics and law. So law generally means legislation, statutes, and regulations made by the state and by the federal government on a host of subjects for the public good and for the public welfare. Laws do not, or are not intended to, incorporate ethical principles or values, but sometimes ethical standards will be reflected in these laws. Ethical standards are not necessarily written down in the form of laws or other rules, but they will represent the collective experience of a society as it regulates the behavior of those who make up that society. The fact that an ethical standard is not repeated or copied in law does not affect the validity of ethical standards. Sometimes laws can conflict with our ethical standards. We look at this where there is a deliberate disregard of the law by those protecting its wrongness, and the result could be an act of civil disobedience. As we look at ethical dilemmas, which we are going to be looking at throughout this entire semester, it is helpful to recognize that when an issue involves ethical considerations and then have the ability to apply a knowledge of ethics, this will include ethical terminology and concepts that will help you make your decisions on what you are going to do. And just know, everybody's decision may be a little bit different based on the circumstances of the situation. A number of ethical approaches can be taken in making a decision about an ethical issue, and no ethical approach is considered the quote-unquote correct one. Rather, a different approach may be equally valid in ethical terms. The approach that we are going to adopt to an ethical issue will frame and give meaning to any decision that we make and can be used to justify or validate our actions. So basically, as long as you are within the realm of what you are supposed to do, as long as you can justify why you did what you did, then there's not going to be any consequences potentially held against you. It will always be possible to abandon the responsibility for making an ethical decision. In the criminal justice system, for example, a prosecutor may have to make decisions on whether to seek a maximum penalty against an accused under a three-strike legislation. We will look at this a little bit more in depthly, but a prosecutor may decide to act ethically or within the full weight of this issue in light of the facts of the case and the nature of the crime that is being committed. Alternatively, they may choose not to follow that process and may simply take the position that their law reflects public opinion and that they should always exercise their discretion as to impose the fullest penalty provided by the law. When we decide to accept responsibility and make a decision that involves ethical considerations, we are faced with what is called a personal dilemma. A personal dilemma can be contrasted with an ethical issue, which is usually an issue of public policy that involves ethical questions. An ethical dilemma is a responsibility of an individual and requires a decision to be made, whereas ethical issues, being broad issues of a social policy, do not require individual decision making beyond the decision of whether one is in favor of or opposed to a particular social issue. Ethical dilemmas are important in the criminal justice system because criminal justice professionals are often faced with having to make decisions that involve ethical issues. So a question we have to ask is, how do we recognize when a dilemma is an ethical dilemma as opposed to merely just a dilemma? An ethical dilemma arises only when a decision must be made that involves a conflict at a personal, interpersonal, institutional, or a societal level, or raises issues of right or moral character. We then must look at what process is followed to resolve said ethical dilemma. Richard Hare argues that we initially will use an intuition level of moral thinking when we are considering our ethical dilemma. This provides us with a relative simple principle that is derived from our upbringing and past experiences of decision making. We also look at critical thinking. This is another process of thinking about moral decisions. In contrast to the intuition thinking, critical thinking applies principles that are established by philosophy and a moral concept and is therefore non-intuitive. In making moral judgment, we are faced with moral dilemmas. We must initially apply an intuitive form of thinking. We must rely on our intuitions to identify possible courses of action when making that decision. However, we are likely to find that our instincts do not adequately equip us to make moral decisions and that critical thinking will be required. Hare argues that moral judgments may be able to be applied universally. Although this principle could be used, similar actions ought to be judged based off of what is morally relevant or what is morally different between them. We then have to weigh how our personal values play a part when we are making ethical decisions. So values are going to be referred to as what individuals care about and what they're thinking is important to them. Each person has developed a set of values that have been formed into their value system. We often assume that our values are similar to others. However, we may define values very differently than others do. Even if we do have similar definitions of value, we will often prioritize them differently than others. These are just topics that we're going to talk about briefly, but we're going to be talking about them much more throughout the extent of this course. So first we look at ethical problems in the use of authority. So this is the use of authority to promote personal values, the use of authority to avoid accountability for wrongdoing, and this is also going to include police gratuities, free meals, and discounts on purchases, and so on. Look at ethical problems in relationships between personal and professional interests. So using professional status to promote your personal interests, using institutional time and materials for personal gain unrelated to legitimate work activity. This could also be engaging in or promoting professional activities that are contrary to personal values, or engaging in public or private personal activities that are contrary to professional values. With ethical problems in personal and professional commitments to a client, we could see behaving unethically in a personal relationship with clients, or we could see using relationships with clients or the public for our personal gain. With ethical issues in criminal justice and public policy, some things that we look at are the war on drugs. We also look at government policies that have implications for criminal justice professionals in issues such as youth confinement, the fingerprinting of juveniles. We also look at compulsory treatment such as mandatory participation in substance abuse programs or anger management, capital punishment, the move away from rehabilitating juvenile justice policy and more towards the punitive policy because that pendulum is always swinging back and forth. We also look at policies involving harsher punishments or penalties that result in prisoner warehousing. We have government-imposed mandatory sentencing. We have truth in sentencing policy, and increased surveillance of our citizens within a society. The policies implemented in a war on terrorism, internet sexual exploitation, and finally, criminalization of immigration, what we have now termed crimination. Also have ethical issues that have resulted from our policing policies. So policies for policing in domestic violence cases. So how do we handle those cases now versus how we've handled them in the past? We also look at racial profiling, the use of force, the use of police discretion, rules or practices related to the retention or the disposal of court records, body cameras, stop and frisk. All of these are going to be things that we are going to be covering throughout the semester. Move into ethical problems in dealing with human rights issues within our criminal justice system. So the administration of cruel and unusual punishment, human rights violation against prisoners, capital punishment, armed drones and targeting citizens and killings or torture. We're also going to be addressing ethical problems in information sharing. So the ethics of withholding information. So whether that information is being withheld from other law enforcement agencies, other lawyers, if you're a prosecutor and you're working on a case and you're withholding information from the defense, something like that. We also look at problems with confidentiality and privileged communication. This is our last slide that we're going to finish up with today, looking at the ethical issues of the media reporting of crime. So what is the crime in public opinion? Crime as an entertainment, the politicizing of a crime, and representation of particular groups of offenders and of women or female